The entertainment industry is full of memorable moments, whether it's film, music, classic sitcoms, sports, or some combination of the above. Timeless images of entertainment history are forever entrenched in our memories. Mention the World Wrestling Federation or World Wrestling Entertainment if you prefer, and among the first events people will recall is the slam heard round the world at WrestleMania 3 back in 1987. Those who were alive and watching the spectacle can tell you where they were at the time. Those who watched it after can probably tell you their immediate reaction and starstruck feeling that surrounded the entire event. Even those who were born after this are aware of the night that the irresistible force met the immovable object. And while multiple toys representing Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant would be released in years other than the one we're going to be talking about today, it's worth noting the extended cast of characters of this year that comprise the action figure lineup to help you build a roster around these two iconic wrestlers. The superstar choices to make it into toy form this year did a lot to flesh out the existing ensemble group established by the three previous release years, not to mention giving more options to create your own supercard selection of matches for your living room and backyard playtime adventures. While the large-size nature of these figures made it difficult to do crossovers with other popular toy lines at the time, there's no denying it did make them stand out on store pegs when you shopped for toys with your mom and dad. And whether you have your own memories of this year or you're learning about it after the fact, either way, it's time for another Toy Connections history video. With that, let's dive in and talk about this particular part of toy history. So it's time once again to tag me in and ring that bell, because this is the story of LJN's WWF Wrestling Superstars in the year of 1987. While it's hard to argue that the pinnacle sports entertainment moment in 1987 was indeed WrestleMania 3, there was still lots to talk about aside from this milestone evening of an event and the monumental attendance at the Pontiac Silverdome back in March of this particular year. This year also saw the inception of the Survivor Series in November, beginning an annual tradition that still runs strong to this day, and Jim Crockett Promotions still held events year-round, serving as the only regional territory of the now floundering National Wrestling Alliance capable of providing some form of competition to Vince McMahon and his rapidly expanding wrestling empire. Indeed, WWF merchandise was anywhere and everywhere, and wrestling had gotten to the point where several superstars were becoming a brand unto themselves within an increasingly popular sports entertainment genre. And along with merchandise comes the usual influx of toys. And in the case of LJN's Wrestling Superstars, this meant yet another wave of larger scale, rugged, and rubbery figures stylized after your favorite WWF superstars. At first glance, you'll see the increased number of figures, a trend started a year earlier in 1986 as the character selection had been broadened compared to the previous smaller rosters of 1984 and 1985. Perhaps it was a celebration of the rising dominance of his wrestling business or pure coincidental timing, but WWF owner and promoter Vince McMahon was among those to receive an action figure this year. While it wasn't public knowledge yet that Vince was the owner, he was frequently seen hosting WWF branded events as a ringside announcer. And combined with Jesse the Body Ventura released the prior year, you had a full commentary crew to call your matches for your fantasy booking purposes. Also, we can reasonably state that commentator and interviewer type of figures were probably less popular to kids since they didn't make sense to bash around as wrestlers. But trust that figures such as Vince have seen a significant spike in price in recent years amongst collector circles. Having said that, LJN's WWF Superstars was no stranger to adding supporting characters to the wrestlers who took center stage. From that perspective, it only made sense to see a release of the First Lady of Wrestling, Miss Elizabeth, in this year. Commonly appearing with her gold skirt release, she also came in a much rarer and now more expensive purple skirt appearance. Hardcore collectors will obviously want both versions, but any way you slice it, having a manager for the ever-popular Macho Man Randy Savage just made sense, as they are among the most iconic pairings not just in wrestling, but in pop culture history as a whole. Then of course you've got my favorite wrestler of all time, a well-known Canadian hero in Bret the Hitman Hart, as well as his brother-in-law, Jim the Anvil Neidhart. Released both individually and later on in a 2-pack, it's only fitting to put the tag team title belts on these two, seeing as 1987 was the year that they won these belts for the first of 2 title runs. It should also be noted that the Hart Foundation did come in multiple variants with both lighter as well as darker colored ring tights. Bret would go on to have a legendary career with an endless amount of matches, becoming one of the most decorated wrestlers in history. Jim the Anvil would also see a career resurgence in the 1990s as the two aligned themselves with the second incarnation of the Hart Foundation, and another generation of Harts would form many years later with the Hart Dynasty. I could go on, but what I'm trying to say is that the legacy of the Hart Foundation began here with this tag team, and by and large with this initial title run in this year. The tag teams were doubly well represented this year, with Brian B. Blair and Jumping Jim Brunzell as the Killer Bees. Their colorful and gimmicky nature speaks to the way WWE was programmed back in the day, such that attires like these were considered a good idea in the wrestling mid-card scene back then. Like the Hart Foundation, the Killer Bees also had multiple variants, with some having darker skin tones than others. And since we did talk about the wrestling territories just a moment ago, here's Harley Race. Going by his King gimmick and sporting the pricey crown that is hard to get on the secondary market, this figure represents Harley in the late stages of his career when he was still a big name in the industry, albeit now hanging out with the Heenan family stable. While his prime years mostly occurred in the AWA as well as touring the National Wrestling Alliance, it was great to see Harley Race get a figure here during his active career before his wrestling days were over. And even though the mid-card scene was the primary focus of this particular year of LJN WWF Superstars, there were still a few who became household names despite not being consistently pushed at the top of the WWE's roster. Among the best examples of this is Jake the Snake Roberts, known for his intense promos, his devastating DDT finisher, and of course his pet snake Damien. Jake didn't get the same opportunity to main event at WrestleMania like Hulk Hogan or Macho Man Randy Savage, but say his name to literally anyone who knows anything about wrestling, and they'll be more than likely to tell you that they remember this man very, very well. And also among those who hung out with the main eventers and got to share some of that spotlight as early as the first WrestleMania is Cowboy Bob Orton. Being good friends with Rowdy Roddy Piper and Paul Mr. Wonderful Orndorff in his early years, Cowboy Bob may be a legend, but today his son Randy Orton is as big a name as any and has exceeded his father's legacy. My version of Cowboy Bob doesn't have his hard-to-find hat, but maybe that'll change someday. Either way, he's yet another on the list of wrestlers with memorable gimmicks and personalities during this all-too-great and golden era of professional wrestling. I mentioned the heels a moment ago, and yet another member of the Heenan family faction is a powerhouse of a man in Hercules Hernandez. I don't really think that this is a great representation of him, because when you compare this to historic photographs of him, he doesn't often look or dress this way. Having said that, when you only had a single option for a figure back then, you'll find ways to justify putting it into your collection. Of course, what Heenan family is complete without the mighty Hercules? And also a different kind of powerhouse also made a name for himself in this era, the Uganda giant, Kamala. Another star of the wrestling territories, Kamala was branded as a savage beast of a man, someone who could even stand toe-to-toe with the awesome power of Hulkamania in the ring once he joined the WWE, and serve as a giant heel that felt rewarding when the good guys got a victory over him. He'd be managed by Slick at times during his career, and despite his struggles later on in life, Kamala's prime years are forever entrenched in our memories as a staple of 80s wrestling. And while Jake the Snake had his pet Damien, who could ever forget the Birdman Koko B. Ware? With his flamboyant attire, his catchy theme music, and his epic bird that they'd call Frankie, the Birdman seemed to alternate between being a successful WWE mid-card act or being used as an enhancement talent to make other stars look better. Either way, he added a high level of charisma to the WWE roster, be it in the 80s or early 90s. Now, some may remember him and some may not, but Olympic weightlifter and strongman turned pro wrestler Ken Patera was also among the WWE's roster at this time. I don't have a ton of memories of Ken Patera, but the one thing he'll forever be known for is being on Hulk Hogan's team at the inaugural Survivor Series, taking on the likes of Andre the Giant and other iconic bad guys of the 80s. You may notice that my collection is missing a few members of this famed 1987 LJN WWF Superstars cast, notably adorable Adrian Adonis, Billy Jack Haynes, Ted Arcidi, and Outback Jack. The reason for that is I don't consider myself a full-on completist when it comes to collecting these vintage wrestling superstars figures. My memory of these wrestlers varies depending on the event, and I tend to remember them more when I'm in the moment watching an old event via streaming services. But if you are a completist of old school WWF LJN figures, I definitely recommend getting all of these characters. Now, while that may cover the cast of official releases as far as this Series 4 of LJN's Wrestling Superstars is concerned, 1987 also brought about another figure that most people would want to have to make your Wrestling Superstars experience feel even more complete. That's right, an 8-inch tall Sergeant Slaughter, perfectly scaled and posed in the LJN style, was released by Hasbro in 1987 as a mail-away offer that was normally saved for their 3 3/4-inch G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero brand of figures. As the story goes, Sarge was a big name in the World Wrestling Federation in 1984, matched in popularity probably only by Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. However, signing a deal to appear as a G.I. Joe character as early as 1985 meant the end of Sarge as a WWF personality and character for the time being. Note that this figure is made of a more rigid plastic material rather than the rubbery style LJN figures that were typical of the time. And while he wouldn't go back to work for Vince McMahon again until 1990, Hasbro saw a good opportunity to capitalize on sales and make this figure, which is now considered a holy grail, not to mention a highly priced and highly prized figure. But this of course makes 1987 all the more special, seeing as both my favorite wrestler of all time in Bret Hart and the crossover G.I. Joe and wrestling icon got released in this scale and style in the same year. No, it's not technically branded nor endorsed as an LJN WWF Superstars official product, but many collectors in the wrestling fandom very much consider it part of their list of must-have figures. And by extension, it can unofficially be classified as a Series 4 figure given the year it was released. I also happen to have a copy of his mail-away form, albeit this one being a Canadian form that actually has the Canadian office address at the time to mail away and get the figure from. Needless to say, it was a good time to be a wrestling fan, and this series of toys came during a time when sports entertainment was just ramping up. In other parts of the boys targeted toy industry, 1987 represented a year where Masters of the Universe would see a decline. Both Transformers and G.I. Joe would see the end of their original television runs in North America, and this was a gap in time before Turtle Power would hit the airwaves literal weeks before 1987 was over. Of course, LJN Wrestling Superstars would carry on for another year in 1988, and yet another year in 1989 that would see itself transition to the much smaller Grand Toys to carry the final wave of Wrestling Superstars figures when LJN's toy division was shut down. Either way, the legacy of these iconic rubberized wrestling representations is firmly entrenched as part of toy history. The wonderful thing about wrestling is seeing all the colorful and expressive personalities involved and knowing that these characters have stood the test of time, such that both new and old wrestling fans still talk about them to this day. As such, it was a pleasure to dive in, not only to discuss the topic of LJN wrestling figures this year, but also to discuss the key moments in the WWF that occurred during this time as well. And regardless if you're still a wrestling fan today or if you bowed out of watching this brand of entertainment years ago, you can always look back at these toys and be reminded of the feel-good, innocent days of wrestling's past. After all, it's the stars of the past that paved the way for the stars of the present and future. With that, special thanks to my Patreon supporters and channel members whose names can be found in the description section of this video. Visit patreon.com/toyconnections for some behind the scenes footage and other bonus content, or click the join button next to my channel name to unlock special custom badges and emojis for your use in any Toy Connections video or live stream. Now, if you enjoyed this Toy Connections toy history, you can see some of my other content, including other wrestling related videos here. Subscribe if you already haven't. Press that like button to spread this video to more viewers and share it with your friends. Otherwise, I'll see you again soon with some more of my favorite toys. Thanks again, and take care.